alligator gar. For most of the 20th century, state agencies across the South tried to kill this fish on purpose. Wildlife officers shot alligator gar on sight, agencies ran poisoning campaigns against it, and a 1920s Illinois report on game fish described it as useless and destructive in our productive waters as wolves and foxes formerly were in our pastures and poultry yards. The assumption was simple. A fish this big had to be devastating bass and catfish populations. It hunts by doing almost nothing. Alligator gar hangs motionless near the surface, mistaken for a floating log, until something edible drifts close, then lunges sideways and thrashes its head to drive its teeth through the prey, before swallowing it head first. That patience is exactly why the extermination theory turned out to be wrong. When researchers finally studied its actual diet, they found an opportunistic scavenger and generalist predator, not a specialized threat to game fish. A hatchling eating insect larvae, a juvenile moving on to shad and young carp, an adult graduating to full-grown fish, turtles, waterfowl, and small mammals. Once it clears about 3 feet, its only real predator left in the water is an American alligator. The lifespan is the real outlier here. Females mature around 10 years old and can live past 50. Males mature around 6 and typically live into their mid-20s. Growth explodes early. 5 inches in the first month, 30 by the first winter, then slows to a crawl. A 6-footer is usually 10 to 30 years old, and reaching 7 feet can take up to 50. Spawning depends entirely on major spring floods, when groups of 5 to 20 adults leave the main river for flooded grass. Eggs toxic enough to deter the crayfish and rodents drawn in by the splashing. The current world record, 8 feet 5 inches, 327 pounds, caught in Mississippi in 2011, was aged at roughly 95 years old. Decades after the bounty campaigns nearly wiped it out in places, alligator gar is now one of the most sought-after catch-and-release trophy fisheries in Texas and Louisiana, protected, in some states, specifically to keep its oldest individuals alive, longnose gar. No gar covers more ground than this one, a range running from Quebec down through the Mississippi Basin into Mexico and Florida, the widest distribution of any species in the family. The hunting style is built entirely around that long, needle-thin snout. Longnose gar holds nearly still in slow current, vibrating its fins just enough to hold position without drawing attention, looking exactly like a drifting stick, then snaps sideways to grip prey rather than shred it, working it around in its jaw before swallowing head first. It feeds almost entirely on other fish, mostly at night. In one Lake Texoma study, small silversides made up 84% of the juvenile diet alone. Adults face almost nothing beyond humans, and, at the southern edge of the range, alligators. Juveniles aren't so lucky. Other gar, larger fish, wading birds, snapping turtles, and water snakes all take them before they're grown. Growth moves fast early, roughly 20 inches in the first year, with females reaching about 33 inches by age 6. Typical lifespan runs 15 to 20 years, with the oldest confirmed individual on record reaching 39. Like its bigger cousin, longnose gar was targeted by early 1900s eradication efforts built on the same mistaken belief that it was wrecking game fish populations, and it's still recovering from that history today, with overfishing and dam-blocked migration routes now doing what the old poisoning campaigns started, particularly hard on a species where females don't mature until around 6 years old. Shortnose gar. Ask most anglers to identify a shortnose gar, and they usually can't, not because it's rare, but because it's the least distinctive member of an already understated family. No long snout to give it away, no spots to count, just a stouter build that splits the difference between its more recognizable relatives. That plainness comes with a broader diet. Where longnose gar sticks almost entirely to fish, shortnose gar regularly adds crayfish and insects to the menu. A more opportunistic feeder, using the same ambush and lateral strike method the rest of the family shares. Its interlocking scale armor does most of the predator avoidance work for it, leaving relatively little that can seriously threaten an adult. Growth is modest, about 7 inches in the first year, 15 by age 3, when most individuals reach maturity, and maximum length caps out around 2.5 to 3 feet, making it one of the smaller species on this list. Spawning runs April through June in cooler water than most of its relatives tolerate, females scattering yellowish-green eggs among submerged vegetation, often trailed by more than one male at once. It's obscure enough today that in a few states, Montana and Ohio among them, problem. It's flagged as a species of conservation concern simply because almost nobody's tracking its numbers closely enough to know for certain how it's doing. Spotted gar. You can identify this one before you even get it out of the water. Dark, irregular spots scattered densely across the head, body, and fins, dense enough near the skull that field guides use head spotting specifically to rule out its look-alike relatives. It hunts from cover rather than open water, holding motionless inside dense vegetation and using a lateral line system to sense prey moving through murky water before it can even see it. The diet leans harder on invertebrates than most gar bother with. One study found crayfish made up 47% of stomach contents, ahead of fish like bluegill and warmouth. Unlike its bigger relatives, spotted gar sits solidly in the middle of its food chain rather than at the top. Larger fish, alligators, wading herons, and cottonmouth snakes all prey on it, especially right after the eggs hatch. Males mature around 2 to 3 years old and typically live to about 8. Females mature a bit later and live longer on average, up to a documented maximum of 18. Spawning runs April through June. A single female, often courted by several males at once, laying up to 20,000 sticky, toxic green eggs on plant leaves. In parts of its northern range, spotted gar has become genuinely rare. Canadian surveys have turned up fewer than 55 specimens total, and habitat loss from dredging and shoreline development remains the primary reason it's listed as a species at risk there. Florida gar. Florida gar and spotted gar are close enough in appearance that most people who've correctly identified one still can't tell you what separates it from the other. They're sister species, and the confusion runs deep enough that Florida gar has become one of the most frequently mislabeled fish in the pet trade, sold under the wrong species name to buyers who never noticed the swap. Its strike might be the fastest single moment in the entire family, a lateral head snap lasting only 25 to 40 milliseconds. Over before most prey could register the attack. It floats disguised as debris, then thrashes its head side to side to reposition prey for a head-first swallow. Adults taking fish, shrimp, and crayfish. Juveniles starting on zooplankton and insect larvae. In the canal systems and wetlands of the Everglades, it functions as a genuine apex predator, with researchers crediting it with helping structure the entire food web beneath it. A long-term Everglades study aging nearly 500 fish found a real split between the sexes. Females reached a maximum recorded age of 19 and grew noticeably larger, while males topped out around 10 years and stayed smaller, with a meaningfully higher mortality rate along the way. Spawning happens earlier than in most of the family, typically February into March, tracking Florida's mild winters rather than the temperature threshold most of its relatives wait for. Tropical gar. South of the U.S. border, in southern Mexico's Tabasco region, this fish isn't just wildlife, it's dinner. Known locally as peje lagarto, tropical gar is grilled, seasoned with chili and lime, and served as a genuine regional specialty, distinctive enough to show up on menus and in local identity the way a signature dish defines a place. Biologically, it's the family's generalist. Where most gar stick almost entirely to fish, tropical gar will eat fish, crustaceans, plant matter, and even decomposing organic material depending on what's available. Still hunting the same way its relatives do, ambush from cover, sideways strike, head-first swallow, just with a far less picky menu behind it. It's also the smallest member of its genus by a wide margin, typically under 2 feet in the wild and rarely topping 4, dwarfed by its close relative, the alligator gar, despite sharing the same broad-snouted body plan. Spawning ties to the region's dry season rather than a fixed temperature, and wild individuals can live around 25 years. That regional fame hasn't protected it. Wild tropical gar populations have declined noticeably in recent decades, driven by the same habitat loss and water system changes hitting gar everywhere else, enough that much of what's eaten as peje lagarto today comes from aquaculture farms rather than wild-caught fish, a food culture increasingly running on captive-raised stock instead of the river fish that gave the dish its name, Cuban gar. Before 1999, researchers counted somewhere between 150 and 200 Cuban gar per linear kilometer through Cuba's Zapata swamp. Surveys run in the years since have found somewhere between 1 and 5. The collapse traces back to a single decision. In 1999, Cuban authorities introduced the African walking catfish into the swamp as a food aquaculture source, an invasive predator that devastated the wetland habitat Cuban gar depends on. It compounded a threat the species had never evolved defenses against in the first place. Introduced largemouth bass, which now prey heavily on young Cuban gar, in a way nothing in its 140-million-year history prepared it for. The IUCN listed the species as critically endangered in 2020. Biologically, it's the family's second-largest species after alligator gar, capable of reaching 6.5 feet, hunting the same ambush and lateral strike style as the rest of the family in slow, vegetated water. Reproduction ties to seasonal floodplain flooding on its home rivers, the same basic strategy alligator gar uses further north, with larvae hatching at around half an inch and clinging to submerged structure with an adhesive head organ before growing large enough to swim freely. This is a fish that survived multiple mass extinction events and outlasted most of the dinosaurs it shared the planet with. It may not survive the last 25 years. Biologist Andres Hurtado and a team working out of a swampside breeding center have raised roughly 60 captive Cuban gar specifically for release back into the wild. Some juveniles have already gone back into the water. Nobody yet knows if they've survived.